Chapter 1-1. The Quiet Beginning. It was upon a mist-laden evening in the autumn of 1893 that I found myself once more before the glowing hearth of our lodgings at Baker Street, where Sherlock Holmes sat in his customary armchair. He leaned back, against the cushions with his long, delicate fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes half closed as though he were lost in some profound reverie. A gray curl of smoke from his pipe circled lazily above his head, weaving ghost-like patterns in the lamplight. I had grown accustomed to such silences, for they were the preludes to his moments of brilliance. Yet, even after years of companionship, I never ceased to marvel at the singular intensity of his mind, the manner in which he seemed to withdraw from the world of men into some secret chamber of thought from which he would emerge with revelations. That startled the imagination. For my part, I was content to watch the firelight and listen to the muffled sounds of carriage wheels upon the wet street below. London, in such weather, wears a melancholy air. The fog presses against the windows, the gas lamps glow faintly like dim stars, and one feels the city itself to be brooding upon unspoken secrets. It was in this mood of tranquil expectancy that the evening was interrupted by the rattle of wheels upon the cobblestones and the sudden stopping of a hansom before our door. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread sounded upon the stair, followed by a firm knock. "A visitor for you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, and without further ceremony ushered in a gentleman whose appearance at once commanded my attention. He was tall, though stooped as if under some heavy burden, and his features bore that drawn and haggard look which I have so often observed in those oppressed by fear. His eyes darted anxiously about the room until they settled upon Holmes, who regarded him with that keen, hawk-like expression which never failed to unnerve the stoutest hearts. "Pray be seated, sir," said my friend in his calm, even tones. "I perceive that you have come to us straight from a long journey. Your cuffs are marked with the dust of the road, and the stain upon your left boot could only have been gathered from the clay lanes of Surrey." The stranger started visibly, then sank into the offered chair as though his strength were nearly spent. "You are correct, Mr. Holmes," he said hoarsely. "I arrived from Guildford scarcely an hour ago, and I come to you because there is no other man in England who can help me." Holmes inclined his head slightly, but his eyes glimmered with curiosity. "Then you must lay your difficulty before us without delay." The man drew a trembling hand across his brow. "It is not easy, gentlemen. What I have to tell you borders on the incredible, and yet I swear it is the truth. A shadow has followed me these past months, a scarlet shadow, if I may put it so, and last night it left behind it death." At these words, I confess I felt a chill run through me, for there was that in his tone which spoke not of superstition, but of mortal terror. Holmes, however, leaned forward, his eyes alight with sudden interest. "Death, you say? Then pray begin at the beginning, and conceal nothing from us. For believe me, sir, it is often in the smallest detail that the truth is most readily found." And so, in the fog-bound stillness of Baker Street, with the lamplight flickering upon Holmes's intent features, the tale began which was destined to draw us into one of the strangest and most perilous adventures of our long association. Chapter 2. The Crime Emerges. The man sat hunched upon the edge of his chair, his pale hands clutching one another with a nervous energy that betrayed his inward agitation. For some moments he seemed unable to frame his words, and it was only after Holmes had poured him a glass of brandy that he found his voice. "My name," said he at last, "is Sir Reginald Alderwood. I am the last of my line and master of Alderwood Hall, an estate which has stood in Surrey since the reign of Queen Anne. My affairs, both public and private, have until recently been of the most unremarkable nature. Yet, for the past 6 months my life has been haunted, not by specters, gentlemen, but by something more deadly, the deliberate persecution of an unseen foe." Holmes inclined his head, his eyes gleaming in the lamplight. "You spoke just now of a scarlet shadow. A curious phrase. "Pray, explain." Sir Reginald moistened his lips. "It began in the spring. One morning I found, nailed to the great oak doors of my hall, a scrap of paper bearing only a crimson mark, the impression of a hand, smeared as though in blood. There was no writing, no explanation, merely that ghastly print." "Interesting," murmured Holmes, leaning forward. "Continue." "Since then," the baronet resumed, "similar warnings have appeared at irregular intervals upon the garden wall, slipped beneath my study door, even upon the very pillow where I lay my head. Always the same scarlet hand. I thought at first it a grotesque jest, but my servants whispered that it was an omen, and some have since deserted me." "Superstitious nonsense," Holmes remarked curtly, "and yet I perceive matters have escalated beyond mere symbols." "They have indeed, Mr. Holmes. For last night a man was murdered within the grounds of my estate." I started in my chair, but Holmes's expression remained one of cold absorption. "Who was the victim?" he asked. "A poor fellow named Thomas Briggs, one of the gardeners. He was faithful, sober, and much attached to the household. At dusk he was discovered lying near the stables, his throat cut from ear to ear. And, gentlemen," Sir Reginald's voice faltered, and he cast a fearful glance toward the door as though dreading some unseen listener. "Upon his chest was pressed the same scarlet hand." Holmes's eyes narrowed, and he tapped his long fingers upon the arm of his chair. "Describe this mark. Was it the impression of an actual hand, or the drawing of one?" "It was no mere drawing. The print was wet, sticky, as though made with some vile red substance. The coroner has yet to pronounce, but I swear to you it was blood." There was a silence, broken only by the distant rumble of wheels upon Baker Street. Then Holmes rose abruptly and paced the room with quick, impatient strides, his face alight with the peculiar energy which only the scent of mystery could awaken in him. "Watson," said he, "this has the makings of a most singular affair. A family seat, a persecuted baronet, a series of warnings, and now murder. All bound together by a symbol at once grotesque and theatrical. It smacks of a mind at once cunning and deranged. Sir Reginald, I must ask, who in your circle bears you enmity?" The baronet hesitated. "There are those who might begrudge me, Mr. Holmes. My younger brother, Arthur, was long disinherited, for debts and wild living. There is also my steward, Mr. Blackwood, who has grown sullen of late, and—" He stopped, visibly troubled. "There are old matters, long buried, which I scarcely dare revive." "Every matter must be revived," Holmes said sharply. "The dead do not bleed for secrets, but the living kill for them. You will furnish me with every detail, however trivial it may appear to you." The baronet bowed his head in reluctant assent. Holmes halted before the fire, his thin profile cut against the glow. "Watson, we leave for Alderwood Hall in the morning. I would see this scarlet shadow for myself." And thus it was that the quietude of Baker Street gave way to the first stirrings of a mystery which promised to test Holmes's powers to their very limit. Chapter 3. The Call to Holmes. The morning following Sir Reginald's visit dawned bleak and sullen. A fine drizzle clung to the panes of our sitting-room window, and the heavy November fog hung low over London, shrouding the city in its familiar melancholy veil. Yet Holmes was in high spirits, moving briskly about the room as he gathered his magnifying lens, a small case of instruments, and the inevitable notebook in which he jotted his observations with that cramped, precise hand of his. "You perceive, Watson," he remarked, "that we are faced not with a mere act of violence, but with a drama carefully staged. The Scarlet Hand, theatrical in conception, ghastly in execution. We shall find, I am convinced, not a lunatic's scrawl, but the deliberate calling card of an intellect which delights in both terror and secrecy." I could not but shiver at his words. You think then, Holmes, that this symbol was left not to mislead, but to frighten. Precisely, my dear fellow. Fear is often the most efficient instrument of power. We must determine who profits from Sir Reginald's terror. Our client rejoined us shortly thereafter, pale and anxious, and together we set off in the early train from Waterloo. The gray countryside swept past in a blur of dripping hedgerows and sodden fields until at last we came to Guildford, where a carriage awaited us. As we left the town behind, the road wound upward into a desolate stretch of heath and woodland, the air damp and chill, the sky a canopy of lead. Alderwood Hall soon rose before us, its somber brickwork darkened by centuries of weather. It stood amidst a grove of ancient oaks, its mullioned windows like watchful eyes, and there was about the place an air of brooding solitude which seemed in keeping with the tragedy it had so lately witnessed. We were received by a grave-faced butler who led us without ceremony to the stables, where the gardener's body had been discovered. The place was deserted, save for a solitary constable, who touched his helmet respectfully as Holmes knelt beside a darkened patch upon the straw-strewn ground. "This is where he lay?" Holmes asked curtly. "Yes, sir," replied the constable. Face upward, his arms spread wide. Holmes drew forth his lens and began his minute examination. I watched as he traced the outlines of a faint discolored imprint upon the flagstones, the blurred shape of a human hand stained in a dreadful crimson hue. He bent closer, inhaled sharply, and touched the mark with the tip of his finger. "Paint," he murmured. "Not blood. Thick, viscous, applied. In haste. Observe the irregular edge, Watson. The fellow who made this imprint bore a scar upon his thumb. See here the indentation where pigment failed to spread evenly." "Remarkable," I exclaimed. "Elementary," Holmes replied, rising swiftly. "What is remarkable, Watson, is the choice of victim. Why Briggs, the gardener, a man with neither fortune nor enemies? Unless—" his eyes glimmered. "Unless he saw too much." We were next conducted to the hall itself, where Sir Reginald presented us to the household, a narrow-faced steward named Blackwood, whose eyes never once met our own, a pale governess, Miss Eliza Vane, who seemed perpetually on the verge of tears, and a handful of nervous servants who shrank from the very mention of the scarlet hand. Of Sir Arthur, the younger brother, there was as yet no sign, though I learned he had returned to the district only days before. Holmes questioned each, in turn with his customary sharpness, drawing from them trifles of time and place, of sounds heard and shadows glimpsed on the fatal evening. Most could give no more than vague answers, but I noticed Holmes jotting rapidly in his notebook, his eyes flashing each time a discrepancy appeared. At length, as the dusk gathered once more and the great house creaked under the sighing wind, Holmes turned to our anxious client. "Sir Reginald," said he, "I cannot yet tell you the name of your persecutor, but I can assure you of this. The hand that struck down Briggs will strike again, and when it does, we must be ready." I confess a chill settled upon me at those words, for I saw in Holmes's keen expression that he already scented the outline of some deadly design. Chapter 4. The Initial Observations. Holmes wasted little time in idle speculation. The very morning after our arrival at Alderwood Hall, he rose before the rest of the household and set about a close examination of the grounds. I followed him faithfully, notebook in hand, though my own eyes could discern little in the sodden grass and trampled earth save confusion. "Observe, Watson," said Holmes, crouching at the edge of the stable-yard. "The ground here is a palimpsest, a manuscript upon which many feet have written, yet if one reads carefully, the individual characters are still legible." I bent low, straining to see what he indicated. At first there was nothing to my eye but vague depressions. Then, as the pale light shifted, I perceived a clearer outline, a heel print, narrow and pointed, altogether different from the broad-soled boots worn by the grooms. "A woman's shoe?" I ventured. Holmes smiled faintly. "Excellent, Watson. A lady has indeed been here, and at an hour when no lady should be abroad among the stables. Note the sharpness of the impression, suggesting a recent fall of rain. Therefore, she passed here shortly before the murder was discovered." He traced another mark with his long finger. "And here, partially obscured, the print of a riding boot, larger than Sir Reginald's, but not so broad as that of a laborer. A man of middle stature, active, accustomed to horses. Together they suggest, what? A secret meeting, perhaps, under cover of darkness." We followed the faint trail into a copse of trees behind the stables. There, beneath the low branches, Holmes stooped and plucked a small fragment from the ground. It was a shred of scarlet cloth, torn and muddied, no larger than a postage stamp. He turned it over in his hand with evident satisfaction. "Ha! Our shadow begins to take substance," he muttered. "You recall the mark upon the victim's chest, Watson. This dye is the same hue. We are dealing not with random splashes of pigment, but with a prepared substance, carried and applied with deliberate intent." As he spoke, the chill morning air was broken by the sound of footsteps, and we turned to see Inspector Lestrade approaching, his bowler hat pulled low against the drizzle. He greeted Holmes with a curt nod, though I fancied there was a touch of relief in his manner at finding us already upon the scene. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, I suppose you've already made the case as clear as daylight," he said with his usual mixture of deference and irony. Holmes regarded him coolly. "Daylight, Inspector, is rarely found in Surrey fog, yet even a faint glimmer may suffice. Tell me, what theory do you favor?" Lestrade shrugged. "A tramp, no doubt. The grounds have been plagued with them lately. One of the rogues frightened the gardener, struck him down, and left his filthy paw print as a flourish. I've ordered constables to search the roads." Holmes gave a thin smile. "An admirable theory. Simple, convenient, and wrong. For the print upon the victim's chest, though ghastly in appearance, is no more than paint. The hand that daubed, it is no vagrant's but belongs to someone here, within these very walls." Lestrade sniffed, unconvinced, and made a note in his book. I confess that despite my loyalty to my friend, there was something chilling in his certainty, as though a trap already lay hidden within Alderwood Hall, waiting to spring. Later that day, Holmes made a circuit of the manor house itself. He lingered long in the library, scrutinizing a series of ledgers and maps that Sir Reginald had reluctantly provided. He examined the locks upon the windows, the ashes in the hearth, the peculiar pattern of mud upon the flagstones in the east corridor. He even measured the length of a wax droplet upon the stair, muttering half-audible calculations. At last he straightened, his eyes gleaming. "Watson, there is design here. Design and concealment. Someone within this house moves by night, and with purpose. The Scarlet Hand is but the emblem. The true secret lies buried in Alderwood's past. We must dig it up before the shadow claims another life." His words were scarcely spoken when a servant burst in, pale with fright. "Sir Reginald, Mr. Holmes, you are wanted at once. There has been another discovery." Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me, and I knew by the sudden hardening of his features that the game had deepened. Chapter 5. The Circle of Suspects. The servant who had so suddenly summoned us led the way down a narrow passage that opened into the graty hall of the house. There, beneath the painted stare of a dozen Alderwood ancestors, we found Sir Reginald pale and agitated, while the household gathered in uneasy silence. Upon the long oak table lay a sheet of parchment, coarse and yellowed with age. Across its surface was smeared the now familiar emblem, the Scarlet Hand. Beneath it, written in a bold, uneven script, were the words, "Blood begets blood. The debt must be paid." A murmur passed among the servants. Sir Reginald crushed the paper in his hand. "You see, gentlemen, Even here, in the very heart of my home, this shadow pursues me." Holmes took the parchment with gloved fingers, holding it beneath the lamplight. He examined the fibers, sniffed the faint odor of the pigment, and raised an eyebrow. "Red ochre," he said softly, "mixed with oil. Common enough in the artist's workshop. Less so in the hands of an assassin. And the hand itself, note the long fingers, the narrow palm. Why, Watson, it is almost as though the writer wished to give us a portrait of himself." I could make little of this, but Holmes had already turned to the company with that air of quiet command which brooked no resistance. "Sir Reginald, it is time that I heard from each member of your household. We must place in the balance not merely opportunity, but motive." The first to be summoned was Mr. Blackwood, the steward. A tall, gaunt man with a severe countenance, he stood stiffly before us, his hands clasped behind his back. "I have served the Alderwood family for 20 years, said he. "I am no murderer. On the night in question, I was in the accounts room, balancing the quarter's ledgers. The butler can confirm it." Holmes regarded him with a piercing gaze. "Indeed? Then pray explain why your boots bear traces of clay from the stable yard, though your duties keep you within doors." Blackwood flushed darkly. "I passed there earlier that day. The ground was wet." "Quite so," Holmes murmured. "Earlier that day?" He made a note and dismissed him. Next came Miss Eliza Vane, the governess. A fragile woman in her late 20s, she trembled visibly as she spoke. "I was in my room, Mr. Holmes. I heard nothing until the cry was raised. I have no knowledge of these dreadful warnings. I wish only to leave this house." Holmes's gaze softened, though his tone was no less exact. "And yet, Miss Vane, you possess paints for your pupils' instruction, do you not? Including red ochre?" Her eyes widened and she clutched her shawl about her. "Yes, but surely you do not suspect me. I am a servant, nothing more." Holmes said nothing, merely scribbling once more in his notebook. The butler and housemaid were questioned, but their statements added little save that both had seen shadows moving in the corridor after midnight. One swore it was a man's figure, the other a woman's. Holmes only smiled at the contradiction. At length the door opened and in strode Sir Arthur Alderwood, younger brother to our client. He was a striking contrast, broad-shouldered, sunburnt, his dark eyes gleaming with defiance. There was a careless insolence in his manner as he flung himself into a chair. "So, Reginald," said he with a short laugh, "you have brought London's bloodhound to sniff about the place. Will he unearth any ghosts, I wonder?" Holmes regarded him with the utmost calm. "Ghosts, Sir Arthur, rarely leave footprints. Men do. On the night of Briggs' death you were abroad. Where precisely?" "In the village inn, Mr. Holmes. Drinking, if you must know. The landlord will bear witness. And what motive should I have to daub scarlet hands on my brother's walls? It is his fortune, not mine, that is dwindling." I observed Sir Reginald wince at this barb, but Holmes remained impassive. Indeed, fortune often breeds quarrel, and debts often breed desperation. But we will let the facts speak. You are free to go. When at last the questioning was complete, the hall fell silent save for the whisper of the wind in the chimneys. Holmes stood by the great fireplace, his figure tall and spare against the leaping flames. "Watson," said he, "we have seen the players. Now we must unravel the play. Each has motive, each has opportunity, but only one hand dipped in scarlet. And we shall find it if we but follow the smallest thread." And as the clock struck the hour, I felt a chill certainty that within Alderwood Hall lay a coil of secrets, tightening slowly about us all. Chapter 6. The Red Herrings Inspector Lestrade, with the confidence so characteristic of him when once a theory had taken hold, declared on the following morning that the case was all but settled. "You may rest easy, Sir Reginald," said he at breakfast, stirring his tea with complacent vigor. This gardener fellow stumbled across a tramp. The fellow panicked, struck him down, and scrawled this lurid sign to frighten you from further inquiry. A plain case if ever there was one. My men are even now searching the district for a vagrant seen near the heath. Sir Reginald clasped his temples. A tramp! Always a tramp. And yet, Inspector, how comes it that these warnings have plagued me for half a year? Do tramps keep ledgers of their vengeance? Holmes, who had been silent until now, gave a faint smile. An ingenious solution, Lestrade, but it will not suffice. Were it a tramp, how explain the parchment left upon the hall table? Are we to suppose a vagrant slipped through locked doors, daubed his sign upon fine vellum, and vanished without disturbing a single latch? No, Inspector. The answer lies nearer at hand. Lestrade's brow flushed, but he muttered something about fanciful notions, and stalked off to organize his constables. That afternoon, we accompanied him into the village, where the landlord of the inn confirmed that Sir Arthur Alderwood had indeed been present upon the evening of the crime. He swore that Arthur drank deep and left only after midnight. This alibi, though hardly a moral defense, seemed at first to remove suspicion from the younger brother. "And yet, Watson," murmured Holmes as we rode back, "note how our witness, though emphatic in Arthur's presence, was vague as to the hour of his departure. Drink muddies not only the head of the drinker but of the observer as well. I should not hang a cat on such testimony." Lestrade, meanwhile, was in high excitement, for one of his constables had brought word of a ragged fellow seen limping across the fields, his hands stained with some reddish substance. The inspector departed in hot pursuit, convinced he had the murderer in his net. Holmes, however, remained unmoved. "Consider, Watson. A tramp, limping and conspicuous, daubed in red. Too obvious, is it not? A decoy, perhaps, or the convenient scapegoat of one who wishes us misled. I shall be surprised if Lestrade returns with more than a tale of drunken trespass." He was correct. By evening, the inspector was back, sheepishly announcing that the supposed fugitive was nothing more than a harmless tinker whose trade in paints explained the stains upon his hands. The man had never so much as set foot near Alderwood Hall. Confess I felt relief, for the thought of a prowling madman had weighed heavily upon me. Yet the shadow which hung over the house seemed only to deepen, for still no clear light pierced the mystery of the Scarlet Hand. That night, as the household retired, I found Holmes alone in the library, seated by the fire with the scrap of scarlet cloth he had earlier recovered. He turned it slowly between his fingers, his gaze fixed upon some private vision. "Watson," said he softly, "the hand that leaves its mark in paint has not yet finished. We are meant to be blinded by false trails, to waste our strength upon tramps and taverns. But I have seen the truth peep through, faintly like dawn through fog. And when the fog lifts, the hand will reveal not only itself, but the secret it has sworn to guard." I could not persuade him to elaborate further, for he sank once more into silence, his features set in that mask of abstraction which warned me he was following some private train of logic far beyond my comprehension. But in my heart I felt a foreboding, as though the scarlet shadow would not rest until blood was spilled again. Chapter 7. A hidden clue. It was upon the following morning that Holmes at last revealed some fragment of the current which had been sweeping silently beneath his calm exterior. We were summoned to the hall by Sir Reginald, who held in trembling hands the latest parchment discovered upon the threshold at dawn. Like its predecessors, it bore the mark of the Scarlet Hand, but this time the device was accompanied by a single line of script. "The debt is not yet paid." The words, though few, carried with them a dreadful weight. Lady Alderwood turned pale as she read them, while Arthur muttered some oath under his breath and stormed from the room. Lestrade examined the thing with a show of confidence. A common scrawl, nothing more, I'll compare it against the handwriting of known malefactors." Holmes, however, bent over the parchment in silence. He did not study the message itself so much as the manner of its inscription. At length, he laid it down and began pacing the room with quick, nervous strides. "You observe, Watson, how the letters incline sharply to the left?" said he, pausing suddenly before me. "Indeed, Holmes, though I should not have thought it remarkable. On the contrary, the English hand, by custom, slopes to the right. A leftward cast betrays either deliberate disguise or the natural bent of one unused to our script. Coupled with the vellum and the peculiar thickness of the ink, I begin to see a hand not English at all, but continental, perhaps even monastic in training." Sir Reginald started violently. "Monastic, you say? Then it is true. The curse of the Alderwoods is upon me." "Calm yourself, sir," said Holmes, though his eyes gleamed with suppressed fire. "There is more here than superstition. You will recall, Watson, the scrap of cloth I found near the garden path? I examined it last night by lamplight. Its weave is not of English make, but of a heavier texture. Belgian, I should say, used chiefly in clerical vestments. I could not withhold a cry of astonishment. Then you believe our phantom visitor to be a foreign priest?" "Not a priest, Watson, though one who would not scruple to assume the semblance of sanctity if it served his design. Mark me. The hand that scrawled these warnings is guided by knowledge of old symbols, but his object is not devotion, rather deception." At that instant, a servant entered to announce that one of the stable boys had found peculiar marks in the soft earth, by the eastern wall. We hastened there at once. Sure enough, the soil bore the impression of a boot, narrow, long, with an oddly worn heel. Holmes dropped upon his knees, measuring it with his lens and compasses. "See here, Watson. The sole is continental cut, not English. Observe also the depth of the impression. Light for the heel, heavy at the toe. A man who walks with haste, ever leaning forward. Such details, though trifling, speak volumes to one who listens." Lestrade, unwilling to be outdone, muttered something about foreign ruffians, and ordered his men to keep watch upon the ports. But Holmes merely pocketed a small fragment of clay from the track and rose, his expression grave yet triumphant. "We have glimpsed the shadow behind the scarlet hand," said he as we walked back to the hall. "It is no wandering tramp, no drunken brother, no spectral monk. It is flesh and blood, cunningly cloaked, and, if I mistake not, very near at hand." That night, as we sat by the fire, I pressed Holmes for further explanation. He shook his head. "Patience, Watson. The threads are yet too few to weave the pattern entire, but we have at last seized upon one true fiber in this tangle of falsehoods. When enough fibers are gathered, the whole fabric will stand revealed, and, with it, the hand that has sought to terrorize Alderwood Hall." He turned again to the scrap of scarlet cloth, holding it to the lamplight as though it were a page upon which destiny itself had written. I could not sleep for long hours, haunted by the thought that some unseen foe walked even now in the shadows, and of the estate, laying snares more subtle and deadly than we could yet perceive. Chapter 8. Midnight Intrusion. The storm which had threatened all day broke that evening with singular violence. Rain lashed against the mullioned windows of Alderwood Hall, and the groan of the great elms in the park gave to the house an air of siege. It was near midnight when Holmes, who had sat in profound thought for hours, suddenly rose from his chair and extinguished the lamp. "Come, Watson," he whispered. "Leave the fire as it is, but no light. Tonight we may pluck our quarry from the very shadow that shelters him." We waited in silence, the ticking of the clock upon the mantelpiece marking the long, tense moments. From the corridor came now, and again the creak of boards as the old house settled in the wind. Then, faint but distinct, I heard another sound, the stealthy pressure of a hand upon a latch. Holmes touched my arm. His figure was but a shade in the gloom, yet I could feel the suppressed energy that quivered through him. The door to the hall opened with infinite slowness. Against the faint glimmer of the rain-washed windows, there was outlined a dark form, stooping, hesitant. For an instant it seemed but a deeper blot of shadow. Then a pale gleam caught upon steel in the intruder's hand. Holmes sprang forward like a tiger. "Now, Watson!" he cried. I flung myself after him, but the fellow was quick as a hare. With a cry of rage, he hurled the lantern he carried full into our faces, shattering it upon the hearth. The hall was filled at once with the reek of burning, oil, and the crash of falling embers. In the confusion, the man darted toward the eastern passage. "After him!" Holmes shouted. We tore down the corridor, the fugitive's footfalls ringing sharp upon the flagstones. Twice I thought we had him, but each time he slipped like a phantom through some side door or passage. At last he made for the library, where the great windows looked upon the terrace. Holmes, swift and tireless, was upon him even as he strove to fling the casement open. There was a desperate struggle, the man striking savagely with a knife whose blade flashed in the firelight. Holmes wrenched his wrist and the weapon clattered to the floor. I seized the fellow's arm, but with a sudden twist and a strength that astonished me, he broke free, dashed through the half-opened casement, and was lost in the blackness of the storm. We stood breathless, the rain beating in upon us, the hall alarmed by the clamor of our chase. Lestrade and Sir Reginald came rushing, half-dressed and wild with questions. "He was here," I panted. "Holmes had him, but he escaped." Holmes said nothing. He stooped calmly, picked up the dropped knife, and held it to the candle Lestrade carried. The blade was old, curved, and bore upon its hilt a curious design, a cross entwined with serpents. "Aha!" he murmured, more to himself than to us. "As I thought, the past has indeed reached its hand into the present." Sir Reginald's face blanched at the sight of the weapon. "That symbol. It is upon the tomb of my ancestor, who first brought the Alderwood Charter from the Low Countries. For God's sake, Holmes, what manner of foe are we dealing with?" Holmes's eyes gleamed, dark and unreadable. "A foe, Sir Reginald, who knows your history better than yourself, and who counts upon that ignorance to cloak his villainy. But tonight we have stripped him of his mask. He will strike again, rest assured, and when he does, we shall be waiting." With that, he wrapped the knife carefully in his handkerchief and slipped it into his pocket. His calmness after such peril filled me with awe, yet I could not shake the dread that we had brushed against forces both cunning and merciless, and that the game was drawing ever closer to its deadly end. Chapter 9. The Confession of Lady Alderwood. The storm still howled about Alderwood Hall when Holmes requested that Lady Alderwood grant us a private audience. The household had scarcely recovered from the night's tumult. Servants whispered in corners. Sir Reginald strode restlessly through the corridors, and Inspector Lestrade muttered at every step about missed chances. We were shown into the small, withdrawing room, its walls hung with faded tapestries, its hearth glowing faintly with dying embers. Lady Alderwood awaited us there. She sat upright, her hands folded tightly upon her lap, her face pale but composed. The flickering light played upon her features, revealing not merely weariness but the strain of one who has borne a secret too long. Holmes regarded her steadily. He did not bow, nor offer comfort, but stood in silence until the weight of his gaze compelled her to speak. "Mr. Holmes," she said at last, her voice low but firm, "I know why you are here. The intruder who haunted these halls last night, he comes not for the charter nor for gold. He comes for me." I confess, started at her words. "For you, madam?" I exclaimed. She inclined her head. "Yes, doctor. The evil that prowls Alderwood is of my making, though unwittingly. I cannot endure this burden in silence any longer." Holmes folded his arms. "Then tell us the truth, Lady Alderwood. Every fragment, however small, may hold the key." For a moment she struggled, her lips trembling as though some inward barrier held her fast. At length she spoke in a tone that seemed torn from her very soul. 10 years ago, before I wed Sir Reginald, I was entangled. A youthful folly, born of loneliness and vanity. The man was a scholar of sorts, but restless, ambitious, and dangerously persuasive. He told me of secrets buried in our family's past, of documents and relics that would alter the fortunes of nations. I listened. Worse still, I confided in him what little I knew of the Alderwood legacy. When I broke from him, for his spirit was cruel and his demands intolerable, he swore that he would return to claim his prize and punish me for my betrayal. Her voice faltered. She clasped her hands tighter, the knuckles white. Holmes's eyes narrowed, his tone cutting yet not unkind. This man, you knew him by name? She gave a faint shiver. I knew him as Erasmus Veyron, a Belgian by birth. He vanished after I refused him, but I have lived these years in dread of his shadow. When the disturbances began at Alderwood, I knew he had come at last to make good his threat. Holmes drew from his pocket the knife dropped by the intruder, its serpent-entwined cross gleaming in the firelight. Then you recognize this? Lady Alderwood covered her eyes with her hands. It is his. He wore that symbol always, saying it bound him to a brotherhood that reached back centuries. Cabal of men who thrived on secrets and blood. Holmes replaced the weapon, his expression unreadable. You should have spoken sooner, madam. Your silence has placed the whole household in peril. Still, we are not too late. A shadow may be hunted if one knows its form. Tears filled her eyes. I feared Sir Reginald would despise me for my folly, and so I held my tongue, even when the hauntings began. Forgive me, I could endure no more. At that moment the door opened, and Sir Reginald himself stood upon the threshold, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He had heard all. For a long moment there was silence, broken only by the wind rattling the panes. Holmes, never one for sentiment, turned swiftly to practicalities. The adversary is known, the motive declared. What remains is to draw the man into the open. And there, gentlemen, we shall end his masquerade. But as Lady Alderwood bowed her head in despair, I could not rid myself of the sense that Erasmus Veyron was no ordinary foe. His hatred burned not merely with greed, but with something darker. A vendetta fed by years of bitterness, sharpened by secrets we had yet to uncover. And though Holmes exuded calm certainty, I, who knew him well, saw the gleam in his eye that betrayed a rare thing, respect for an enemy worthy of his steel. Chapter X. The trap is set. It was near midnight when Holmes summoned us to the library of Alderwood Hall. The storm had passed, leaving the air heavy and silent, as though the house itself held its breath. The long oak table was strewn with maps of the estate, lanterns burning low, and curious items Holmes had requested from the servants. Lengths of cord, sheets of polished glass, even a hunting net borrowed from the gamekeeper. Sir Reginald stood, stiffly by the mantel, his face dark with shame and anger after his wife's confession. Lady Alderwood, pale but resolute, sat apart in shadow, her hands folded like one awaiting judgment. Lestrade, impatient as ever, muttered about warrants and constables. Holmes, however, moved with brisk, almost theatrical precision. He spoke, little, save when giving instructions. "Doctor, kindly place this mirror at the far casement. Angle it to catch the moonlight. Yes, just so. Lestrade, I must ask you to station 2 men by the servants' wing, but under no circumstance are they to stir until I give signal. Sir Reginald, I require your cooperation most of all. You must write a note in your own hand, one that speaks of the charter and its supposed hiding place. Leave it upon your desk as though carelessly forgotten. That will serve as the bait." Sir Reginald bristled. "And if this scoundrel takes the bait?" Holmes smiled thinly. then the game concludes, one way or another. He paced the chamber, his long fingers clasped behind his back. Erasmus Veyron is no ordinary burglar. He is a strategist, a man who thrives on fear and theatrics. He has sought to cloak his pursuit of the charter in superstition and terror, to weaken your household before striking. But tonight, we turn his own artifice against him. I watched, half in awe, half in dread, as Holmes arranged the room like a stage. The mirrors would catch the faint moonlight, amplifying it into strange flickers across the walls. The net was concealed in shadow behind the desk, and a rope fixed to the window frame lay ready in Holmes's hands. Every detail had been calculated. With his usual precision, at length he extinguished all but one lamp, leaving the library steeped in gloom. He turned to us with the calm of a duelist who has already measured his opponent's reach. "Gentlemen, Erasmus Veyron will come. He believes the charter to be within his grasp, and he will not suffer delay. Lady Alderwood's confession has confirmed what he suspected, and perhaps more. He will enter by stealth, through the eastern corridor where the locks are weakest. Once he crosses this threshold, you must trust me to direct the play. Do not act without my word." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "You speak as if you've invited the devil himself, Holmes." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Perhaps I have. But remember, Inspector, even the devil may stumble when the snare is well laid." The hall's great clock struck 1. Silence pressed upon us like a weight. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind through the stone seemed magnified 100-fold. Then, faintly, unmistakably, came the sound of a latch yielding. A slow, deliberate tread approached along the corridor. Shadows lengthened across the threshold. Holmes raised one hand, and we held our breath. The trap had been set. Now it was only a matter of which player, Holmes or Erasmus Veyron, would seize the final move. Chapter Cruth. The Man in the Moonlight. The moment had come. From the shadows of the corridor, a tall figure emerged, not with the stealth of a thief, but with the unhurried poise of a man entering a chamber he already owned. The moonlight, caught and scattered by Holmes's carefully placed mirrors, fell upon him in broken fragments. First upon the gleam of a silk cravat, then upon a pale, sharp-featured face crowned with raven-dark hair. His eyes, cold and luminous, glinted like twin blades catching firelight. Erasmus Veyron. He paused upon the threshold, his gloved hands clasped lightly behind his back. He regarded the room with a faint, sardonic smile, as though it were all some elaborate theater staged for his amusement. "Sir Reginald," he said smoothly, his voice a velvet drawl that carried an undercurrent of mockery, "you keep your secrets poorly. A note, left so conveniently upon your desk, I expected more subtlety." Holmes, seated in shadow by the hearth, rose slowly. His figure seemed to lengthen as he stepped into the faint wash of moonlight. The two men regarded one another across the chamber, hunter and quarry, though which was which I could not yet say. "You disappoint me, Veyron," Holmes said evenly. "I thought a man of your reputation might at least pretend to caution, but you walk into my snare as though it were a ballroom." Veyron's smile deepened, a razor edge concealed within charm. "Snare? No, Mr. Holmes. A mirror, perhaps. You see me only because I wish to be seen." Lestrade stirred angrily, but Holmes silenced him with the faintest motion of his hand. This was a duel, and it would not be fought with pistols or fists, but with words, feints, and patience. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You cloak yourself in riddles and theatrics, Veyron, but the truth remains simple. The Alderwood charter is not yours to claim." Veyron took a measured step forward, his boots making scarcely a sound upon the carpet. The moonlight shifted across his face, revealing cheekbones cut like marble and eyes of startling intensity. "The Alderwood charter," he murmured almost reverently, "is not a mere document, It is power, the kind that rewrites history, bends fortunes, and buries the sins of men who pretend to be noble. Tell me, Holmes, if such power lay within your grasp, would you not reach for it? Holmes's reply was cold steel. No, for power sought in darkness consumes the hand that grasps it. For a fleeting instant, the two men stood as though frozen in a portrait. Holmes, the embodiment of reason and clarity, and Veyron, the very image of shadowed ambition. Sir Reginald's knuckles whitened upon the mantel. Lady Alderwood, her breath trembling, seemed on the verge of collapse. Then, suddenly, Veyron's gaze flicked to the desk, to the bait Holmes had left. His expression betrayed nothing, but I saw the faint tightening of his jaw. He knew, he understood, and still he lingered, as though daring Holmes to spring the trap. Holmes's hand tightened upon the rope at his side, but Veyron only inclined his head, offering the faintest bow. Until we meet again, Mr. Holmes. Before any of us could move, he stepped backward into shadow, and with a motion too swift to follow, slipped from the chamber like smoke drawn by the night air. Lestrade lunged forward with a curse, but Holmes held him back, his gaze still fixed upon the doorway where Erasmus Veyron had vanished. "No," Holmes said softly. "He is not yet finished with us. This was not a retreat, Inspector. It was a declaration." The room seemed colder, emptier for Veyron's absence, yet his presence lingered still, like the echo of a bell long after its toll. And I knew then, so long as this man walked free, none of us would know peace. Chapter 2. The Broken Mask. The chamber was still heavy with silence after Veyron's departure. Lady Alderwood clutched the folds of her gown as though to steady her trembling heart. Sir Reginald's face was ashen, drawn tight with a dread that words could not shape. Lestrade paced furiously. "We should have seized him, Holmes. He stood within arm's reach. By heaven, you let him slip." Holmes, standing motionless by the hearth, gave no answer. His gaze lingered upon the empty doorway, his profile cast in severe shadow by the flames. At last, he spoke, his voice low and taut. "He wanted us to see him, Lestrade. He wanted us to believe we had the measure of him. And that," he added, his eyes narrowing, "is what troubles me most." I felt a chill at those words, for Holmes, usually so unflappable, bore in his tone a rare note of unease. Suddenly, a sound, a sharp crack like a whip, echoed through the house. Then another. The gas lamps along the corridor flickered, sputtered, and went out, plunging the estate into a suffocating gloom. Lady Alderwood gave a stifled cry, and Sir Reginald cursed under his breath. Holmes moved swiftly to the desk, his hands darting to the document spread across its surface, the bait we had laid. But when his fingers brushed the parchment, his expression hardened. The Alderwood charter was gone. Only a single page remained, its corner marked with an inked symbol, an ornate mask, sketched in black strokes so fluid and bold it seemed almost to leer from the page. Lestrade swore violently. "The devil! He's made a fool of us!" Holmes did not answer. His hands tightened around the paper until it crumpled. His eyes, sharp, burning, remained fixed upon the mocking emblem. "This," he said coldly, "is Veyron's reply. He has turned my snare into his stage." Even as he spoke, a new sound arose. The tolling of Alderwood's great hall clock, heavy and resonant, counting the hour. Yet with each chime, a strange echo followed. A lighter, mocking chime, as though a second unseen clock were striking in mockery. Holmes turned swiftly to the window, and there, across the lawn, upon the rise of the hill, I saw it. A lantern's glow, swaying gently in the night. A signal, a taunt. Holmes's jaw set. He leaves nothing to chance. Even his vanishing act is a message. And mark me well, this was not theft alone, but theater. The broken mask he leaves us is but the beginning. He means to unmake Alderwood, piece by piece, until nothing remains but ruin. Lady Alderwood sank into her chair, her voice trembling. Holmes, he has the charter now. Does that not mean he has won? Holmes turned from the window, the firelight painting his features in stark relief. No, my lady, he said, his voice grim. It means only that the true game has begun. And in that moment, I understood what Holmes already knew. The night belonged to Erasmus Veyron.